Perfect. I think it's time. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Wherever you are in the world, welcome to our webinar, which is a fire chat. As you can see right next to David, there's a little nice cozy fire. Today, we're going to talk about in the age of insight, is identity still the perimeter? My name is Noam Dror. I'm the VP of Solution Engineering at Secupy. And today we have two distinguished guests on our panel. The first one is Mr. David Culbertson, known as @Identity Head on X Twitter, right? The new Twitter.
Former Twitter, yeah.
Former Twitter. So David, take a minute maybe and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Noam. So I've been in the identity and access management space for the better part of this century, at least anyways. And Noam and I, in fact, have spent some time in mutual presence. But my focus over the last several years has been helping customers elevate their identity workloads to the cloud and to support security from a cloud-first approach. And so that's really been my focus. And I'm here today to pontificate on things related to that as they intersect with the world of data.
Sounds good. And then our second distinguished guest is the CEO and co-founder of Secupy, Mr. Alon Rosenthal. So Alon, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Noam. Yeah, been doing data privacy, data security for the last 15 years. I invented the dynamic data masking in my first company. Later was acquired by Informatica. And 7 years ago, we founded Secupy really to solve the fragmentation of the journey to become data-centric, right? The fragmentation that is there from an IAM perspective, from data classification tools, from encryption tools, from access control tools, from database activity monitoring tools, right? So many tools have tried to reach out to this purpose of really being able to monitor, detect, and protect sensitive data. And that's what I've been doing the last 15 years. And great to meet with David and to share our joint experience on this subject.
Makes sense. Sounds good. So let's have a few questions, and maybe the first one is really, we are talking about identity and access management. We're talking about data security and data protection. So if you can tell us a little bit about what happened in the last, let's say, 7 years that evolved those kind of markets, identity and access management and data protection. So maybe, David, if you want to start, tell us a little bit about that evolution.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the clear thing I've seen in the market, right, and customer demand has really been focused on this evolution of identity, migrating these on-premise workloads to the cloud, right? And more importantly, it's kind of a shadow or a parrot of what we've seen go on with classic IT applications. As those workloads have shifted to the cloud, the need to be able to manage identity from the cloud has become ever more present, along with the fact that the legacy systems that were solving identity, 10, 12, 15 years ago simply weren't cutting it from an integration perspective to these new technologies. They weren't built on those technology standards. They weren't able to easily integrate with those technology standards. And so there's a huge, I think, desire to move to kind of a more agile platform that scaled with the business and scaled both directions, right? As we know, business can grow, business can shrink, and mergers and acquisitions give us the flexibility to be able to move across that. So I think over the last few years, it wasn't that we weren't solving the problems. We were solving the problems, but it was almost at any cost. And now there's been a real push and pursuit on cost consciousness, simplification, pushing the administration further and further upstream to the business user community, that kind of thing. Simplification, I think, is probably one of the biggest things to be benefit out of that outside of cost. And that's really what's been driving, I think, kind of the growth, if you will, in the identity space and kind of the resurgence of the identity space really over the last 5-7 years.
Makes sense. So you're saying if it's easy, they'll use it.
Generally speaking, and I mean, and that's actually a really great point. No, I mean, I think, the death knell for many identity implementations has been user adoption, right? If the end user community, the ones that need to embrace self-service to really make these things, pay for themselves and have a return to the organization and help scale the organization as was kind of intended. The adoption has to be there, the user experience has to be there, the simplicity simply has to be there, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it can't be 500 clicks to get to a password reset. It's got to be pretty simple. I always say, like, my 80-year-old mom can do it, then it's good enough, right? That's probably the right level. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So Alon, what do you see? What kind of evolution do you see in the last, I don't know, about 7 years in identity and access management or data protection or both?
Sure. So, well, we see the evolution from who has access to the system, right? Who can log in, to what they actually do once login is provided, right?
yeah.
Once you open the door, right? What's there, right? And this also has been aligned with the need to identify malicious insiders, careless users, credential theft attacks, right? And even we see the same from the perspective of the evolution of zero trust, right? Zero trust before was very network centric. Should somebody have access through the network? And it has been evolving since then to become more data centric. So it's been a journey where before it was really who should have access to the system, to now being much more granular, who should have access to the data within the system. From the perspective of the simplification, that's a great note of David, right? We also have seen the need to simplify with a single sign-on even tools that before were not capable of doing that. For example, direct DB tools. Think of a simple example, dbeaver, right? That would give you access to 500 different AWS RDS or Postgres or Spanner or whatever, right? We want to simplify and hence also secure the access of dbeaver to those hundreds of databases and to everything that is residing on those hundreds of databases. So this is something that we've seen the demand for, to provide a single sign-on MFA also to direct DB tools such as dbeaver, such as even look at Zeppelin, look at Jupyter Notebooks, right? Going and on embracing this notion of single sign-on and simplicity of login, as well as the control of the data that is accessed by the day-to-day tooling out there. That's also been, we started to see that regulated companies, financials, retail, healthcare, and others, they're looking also to embrace that in addition to the movement to the simplification of accessibility.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that we use those kind of buzzwords all the time, like data is the new currency and identity is the new perimeter. So definitely, if data is a currency, you want to protect it better, and you want to, not just provide access to a specific account with currency, but you want to, count the change when you use it, right? That's an important part there. So makes sense. So maybe the next question is, what happened recently that required such a shift of thinking of identity and access management and data protection, and how the two works together?
So I'll take a stab at that one too. I mean, I think, clearly, as we look at what happened since 2020 with the pandemic, with how our labor markets basically became completely decentralized. The notion of a brick and mortar office was completely obliterated overnight, right? And so, these physical perimeters that we used to think of housing our data centers and housing our data, and more importantly, really developing a notion of who should really have this access, because we now have all these new egress points for data, right? People are adopting collaboration tools like Slack and Teams and cloud storage to share and collaborate, cloud tools like Office 365 and Google Suite. Were becoming the mainstay collaboratives. If they weren't already dominant, they were certainly becoming more and more the power play tools. And then you think about things like, Alon brought up a really fantastic point, is you still have developer communities and a whole list of users that have varying arrays of privileged access. And more importantly, and I think to this point, right, is clearly there's also this notion of privileged data tied into this as well too, right? So what should be leaving, quote unquote, the house, the perimeter, right, whatever we want to call it these days, but egressing the notion of what is the legal entity of my firm and going somewhere else, whether that's to my home office or to some other legal entity, right? So huge considerations that I think are shifting the mindset and the notion of not only understanding who has access to what application or whatever, but also going that next click deeper into those for sure.
Makes sense.
Yeah, we see that from also the perspective of evolution of data classification, data catalogs. Right? When you think about it, the adoption of a catalog such as Relation or Colibra or Purview or Informatica, right? The usage of a catalog also created a fiduciary responsibility to really protect the data, because once there's a data catalog which contains the location of the Holy Grail, right, your customer data, your sensitive data, once you have that mapped, you cannot leave your IAM posture as it was before that. You need to step up and to increase the IAM, the Identity and Access Management posture, also to embrace this new information. The data is now identified and you know where the location of that, and for that you know also which are the systems and tools that are accessing this data. So also the proliferation of data catalogs and the proliferation of classification tools from the native cloud or from a third party, right, they are creating also the shift to include into the access control posture more fine-grained accessibility to those data elements that have been classified.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're both saying there are some requirements that came up. I think also, the rise of AI and insights, right? The fact that now you need access to big data and break the silos. There's no longer one system that you get data from, but you get data from everywhere, together with, as you said, David, the maturity of the identity and access management space, where you can do a lot of things that you were not able to do before. And the same thing on the data space, the cataloging, maturing into data governance. I think together take that together with the evolution of zero trust, when it becomes more data-centric, those three elements required kind of a shift in how do I look at securing data using identity and access management. I think that's a big part there.
Well,
I wanted just to share this new view of the zero trust and how it evolved to really embrace this notion. And in the past, the US Department of Defense and the NSA, who have defined the zero trust definition, it was very network centric. It was role-based, it was device-based, user-based, right? Login password access. And this has become data-centric. Right? This is something that was released in the new NSA and the Department of Defense zero trust architecture. Now the definition has been expanded into focusing on data tagging, dynamic data masking, attribute-based access control, DLP, encryption of data at rest and in use. Right? All of these elements come to mind when organizations need to embrace the zero trust. And by the way, you see here so many different themes, right? And usually they would come from different tools. One of the purposes that we really found at Secupy was to provide all of that in a single platform, just to overcome those fast-moving requirements on different elements, from access control for dynamic masking, tagging, classification, etc. But that's one thing. And the second thing, another graph I wanted to share, the proliferation of the data catalogs, right? And the bars here, the risk, the data liability increases as organizations are embracing catalogs, right? Because before you had Elation or Informatica or Colibra, you can say that you don't know where your sensitive data relies. But now when you do have that, and you have started to populate your Colibra and Elation with sensitive data, right, your risk is increased. And here comes the fiduciary responsibility to reduce this, to put those controls on all ways to the data, using dynamic masking, tagging, all the zero trust elements that we've seen in the last slide, in order to reduce this trend and to eliminate the risk and the data exposure of this of the data itself.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So you're kind of getting into the next question there, which is, what are the new approaches because of that change in requirements? What are the new approaches that now identity and access management needs to converge with data protection? So maybe David, you'll start there, and then Alon can continue that.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly, the vendors in the identity space have all seen that regulations mandate that it's not just who has access to what, but the what they have access to, right, becomes so important and so critical. And so many of the vendors in the space, are already dipping their toe, if you will, in the water of what I'll call basic data governance. I think clearly, though, the next level, just like it was in the identity management space, to be able to identify very granular toxic combinations in SAP in the identity world was a huge thing. I think that next level for the data space is the same thing, is understanding, that the frankly, the toxicity of the data, what is what is the risk of that data, and its association to its use and how it's used, not only who it's used by, but when it's used, where it's used, how it's transported, all of those things that tie into the things that Secupi regulates, right? But clearly there's an inflection point where being able to report and have that be kind of in line with the entire identity picture, clearly the identity vendors in the space are lining up for that. I think there's one other quick dimension which I think I kind of lay into. You look at the emerging NIS2 in Europe, and there's some new regulations in the US as well too. They've just recently come to light around third-party access and the whole the supply chains, those kinds of things are the old target break or breach rather. But I think when you think about the third-party access and you start talking about these huge data lakes that are sitting out there like Informatica and stuff, many times in order for inventory control experts at these large vendors for supply chain have to be able to access these systems and gain insights, but managing that third-party access becomes more critical. So I think that's another dimension on top of this. It's not just the employee or the contractor that we're talking about anymore, but there's parties way outside of the organization, and again, foster through collaboration tools, foster through other solutions that kind of play into this whole distributed, decentralized labor force, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. Federation is a big part of it. I agree.
Yeah.
And even looking at specific segments in the identity and access management. Let's take, for example, PAM, privileged access management. So in the old days, we said, okay, let's just rotate the credentials and making sure everything works that way. So that was good.
You got all the roots and all the admins were good,
yes.
Right?
Right. Then we said, let's try to look at systems and let's restrict what they can do in the shell of the system. So you can do whitelist and blacklist, allow, deny, and say what you can do within a system in a shell, again, it was more network oriented because you could do it for network devices or Linux shell commands, but you couldn't do it for anything else. And I think now more and more you see that you want to see what the privileged users are doing with data, directly with data, right? So that's
I would argue that it's possibly even like, rather than thinking about the user in the context of the user being privileged, right? The data is privileged. And
right.
so therefore, who should access it should be very tightly regulated, right? Especially, I think there's some very distinct corollary between, a piece of data's importance or a piece of information or insight's importance, and its relevance to risk for the organization as well too, right? I mean, if something's intellectual property, there's a tremendous amount of risk associated with
Right.
that, egressing my organization inappropriately, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And who should access that? Is it special users, or any privileged users can access that? And that's, if the data is privileged or not, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
it really is. It sounds authoritarian or governmental kind of when you say, top secret or whatever, but we are talking about classifying
Right.
data, but beyond that, I think, categorizing data into alignments of, hey, if this is privileged data, then generally speaking, if people don't have privileged rights, they shouldn't be seeing it, touching it, handling it, whatever, right?
Yeah. Actually, it takes me back to mandatory access control that we learned in CSSP, right? B1, B1 functionality, categorization. And
I won't date myself, but let's say I've worked on B1 Unix systems back
right.
in the days.
Makes sense. So, Alon, what do you see in that space? How does that converge? Those two converge together these days?
Yes. So, the convergence needs to be simple, right? Because convergence cannot require you to change code of your applications. Right? Convergence cannot require you now to create external functions or views, or because applications are out there, right? Deployment is running all the time, and hence we think that this conversion needs to be done with zero code, right? You need to be able to apply the convergence without any changes to your infrastructure, any changes to your tools, any changes to the behavior of your privileged users, your data scientists, your analysts, your business users, whomever, right? Because we need to weave it into the existing framework, whether these are different tools like dbeaver or Zeppelin or Jupyter notebooks, applications, data scientists, tooling like Tableau or Click or Power BI, right? Really, the weaving in of that convergence needs to be done with zero code, and we have been working very hard in the last 7 years to provide this zero code approach that will allow to enforce this convergence of access from the identity to the data across any type of platform, whether this is an on-prem application still running on mainframe, or this is like the latest Snowflake that we need to provision access to people all across the world, and to ensure that those cross-border controls are enforced, right? And this is something that we've been able to do really through the creation of multiple types of enforcers. This is an example of a large deployment in a bank where you can see that the onboarding has taken place with no code changes, no infrastructure changes, by, we call it, dropping those enforcers. The enforcers that see the user, see the data, and through policies provision who should see what, when, and where, across whether these are CyberArk, right, on the PSM, direct DB tools like dbeaver, SQL+, SSMS, and others, applications, orchestration layers like Starburst, Trino, and even applications with other types of enforcers. We call them application overlays that we simply put on applications to be able to enforce this additional layer of protective access, fine-grained access control to the data. So all of that comes to fruition now, and this is really the explosion that we see now, that is driven by whether this is the CCPA, whether this is the new NIST, whether this is the zero trust motion, whether this is even data cross-border control, SHRM2, DORA regulation in Europe or PDPA in Thailand, right? All of those regulations are basically requiring the organization to adapt to this new norm, a data-centric norm. Yeah.
Well, I think it's further exacerbated by the fact that you've got these AI platforms out there, like these chat platforms that are crawling the web, collecting information. If I don't have my S3 containers, locked down, if I don't have my development environments or my production environments, the way they need to be, then I could become an attribute, right? In somebody's next, query, and if they're malicious, right, they could be doing things that could be fostering potentially an attack on my organization or on my own person, depending on, I guess, the importance thereof, right? But I think clearly the ingress point there is APIs and not necessarily human identities, right? And I think that's another domain space that clearly where organizations are starting to triangulate. Okay, well, great, but it's not necessarily Joe that's accessing this data or Noam that's accessing this data, right? It's a bot. And should that bot, be allowed in or not, or whatever, right? That's that, and to be determined. But I think the API space here clearly is another kind of attack vector where we're starting to see a lot of people express concern as their own enterprise data lakes grow.
So how does it really impact different verticals? We also started to talk a little bit about regulations. In the beginning, we talked a little bit about standards like zero trust and NIST, but regulations also, make life a little bit harder to evolve those spaces. So can you give some examples on specific verticals or specific regulations that make an impact in this?
Well, I think clearly, at least in the U.S., one that's always top of mind is the healthcare space, right? Because we are a commercial open market healthcare system versus a government provided healthcare system. And I think in any healthcare system, regardless, one's own personally identifiable information, personal health information are critical assets in there. But there's clearly delineation between staffer roles within the organization and the provider functions and stuff. And I think all of those are becoming more and more front and center. Again, I hate to keep bringing up the pandemic. It's kind of old news, but clearly the first responders and having access to the critical information was important for those people. At the same time, clearly wanted to protect the identity of and the personal information of those being responded to in those situations. And I think another dimension is financial services. I mean, that's where I've spent the vast majority of my career working for New York-based companies and stuff. I did a lot in the financial services sector, and I think again, there's never been, I think, a lack of focus in the financial services on cybersecurity or data protection. In fact, I would say it's probably paramount, but yet we still read about major banks, in the news, right? So I think there's missteps that happen. Some of those missteps likely are, things like making sure that access to data is correct, right? Is just enough access to what I should have access to and nothing more.
Makes sense.
Yeah. From that perspective, we as we serve also multinationals, we have customers from South Korea to California, so we see a lot of requirements around data cross-border controls. The movement of data from on-prem to cloud, of course, but also from cloud to cloud, from zone to zone, right? Especially when the consolidation and the democratization of analytics environments, where they want to consolidate data centrally, right? We do that for a large telecom in Europe that are consolidating data from all of their opcos in multiple countries across Europe. They're ingesting about 80 terabytes of data every day, which we need to encrypt, which we need to identify in different ways in order to adhere to the different sovereignty laws of every country. And within the country, different type of customers would have different requirements. For example, if it's a federal customer or a civilian, where this is a customer that belongs to a certain type of an organization or whatever. So these are things that are going both to the column, row, and even cell level identification that is required to adhere to those sovereignty laws, data cross-border controls. Now they're talking about DORA, a new regulation for the financials, and even the need to segregate duties from the cloud admins. Another a theme that we are hearing more and more is the need to segregate the accessibility of the cloud admins, right? The guys that are configuring your BigQuery or your Redshift, right? What are those administrators can do with our data? Who controls the people who are, setting up your RDS account or Redshift account? Who ensure that they are not accessing your data in an unprofessional way? So we see that also growing more and more. Cloud is expanding those requirements, and hence also the need to do those required controls everywhere, right? From applications, analytics, direct DB tools, etc.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So, so we talked a little bit about those regulations, and we talked about the convergence of the two environments. What are the benefits of that convergence, right? Especially when you look at zero trust, as defined in NIST 800-207, the least privilege methodologies, reducing the attack surface. What are the benefits that you get from that convergence?
So, I think clearly, one of the main reasons people look at converged technologies goes back to my very earliest point, is simplification, right? My first point was around simplification for user experience, but guess what? Admins are users too.
Right.
And the people who have to take care and feed these systems and controls in our environment, are equally important, right? So, well integrated systems that are singular in platform that provide multiple services are clearly becoming, the new chic trend. And it's funny because it's like, for me personally, watching history repeat itself, having worked for a legacy suite vendor that acquired all of its technology separately, versus working for a suite vendor that had developed all of its technologies organically and then provided those as a service from the cloud. The distinction becomes much clearer in terms of the value to the customer. Like, I'm not having to maintain infra, I'm not having to maintain the other pieces, but beyond that, right, it largely parrots the things that I'm already doing with the other workloads that my IT organization needs to run the business, right? So there's linearity there in terms of the mindset and the administrative skill sets and the people and the labor force that I'm hiring to support those things.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Spot on. This mega trend, right, to really provide a data-centric approach to any type of persona accessing the data through any type of means, right? So it's both the who, the how, and the what are coming now into fruition.
Right.
And what we see is the lacking of a consolidated approach to do that, right? So that's really where we come and help our customers to consolidate these through the simplification of access, but really consolidating all of those different approaches to the data.
Yeah. I see two types of benefits. The high level parts is, it's definitely going to be faster. So you can enable the business faster in order to do things, right? Because again, if we are in the democratization of data age and the insight age, you need to provide fast access to users, and you cannot do that when you are siloed and working in different solutions. So definitely enabling the business, reducing costs, right? Increasing compliance. So those are kind of the obvious things that are, more high level, business level. But you get some new benefits out of it. For example, up until today, it was very difficult to track a real user, application user, to a system user and a privileged user, right? So how do I track that David was trying to do something in application that turned into a system account request from a database that turned into something else? So there, I like to discuss data lineage, but here it's a user lineage. How do I
popcorn trail, right? Yeah,
right, exactly. What's really happening behind the scene, and that would also help us reduce the attack surface, because now I can correlate between the real user, the real consumer of the data, to the track that they make in our IT environments. I think that's going to be big. And then, of course, as we do more and more stuff with data, we would need a lot of services to change that data to fit the need, right? Because you cannot give access to everyone to the real data. You need to start massaging the data, changing the data, anonymizing the data, and provide the right data to the right people. And that would require kind of the convergence that would make it happen, right?
Yeah, I think looking at it probably through another lens is that the convergence of these platforms and of these solution spaces, right, really provides something that kind of is missing in a lot of cybersecurity equations, right? And that is context.
Right.
And the context of how something's being used, right? So because and a great notion of this, we were talking earlier, on the vertical markets space, another space that you see, kind of this multi-persona use of data is higher education, right? Because you've got entities that come into a university institution, for instance, through many different vectors, but most importantly, a lot of times it's just rising out of a lower level school system. But you also have students that are professors, you have professors that are students, you have teaching assistants, you have a gaggle of roles, right, that persist across these, and depending on who I log in as, or the time of day even that potentially that I log in as, the context element is critical, not just of the application but the things that I'm touching within that application as well too, because I may need my professor lens on for one hat or for one class, but my student lens on for the others. So
makes sense.
Yeah, we see it a lot in the insurance sector, right? That in the insurance, the people who are insured are sometimes employees, right? So they will have even their own policies,
of course,
or mortgages, right? All of those things. It simply doesn't stop, right?
Yeah. The delineation of, and I think that's something that's interesting. There's a whole other topic we could probably do a webinar on, right? Of the fact that identity and how identity itself has become decentralized. I'm really the owner of my identity. I'm really the owner of my domain, and therefore, I'm presenting who I am to these applications. I'm presenting who I am to these things. But who's validating, who's vetting me? Those things are really, really important now as well too, more than ever, in building that context. So.
Right.
Yeah, self-governed identity. Yeah, it's a big one.
Yep, self-governed identity is becoming critical
Yeah.
mass.
And the basic model would be, right, to have like some kind of a centralized definition, right? The place where you're defining all of those even contracts, conditions, attributes, right, and policies. And then the only way to go forward is to have the centralized place where you're defining those policies, those restrictions, etc., and then being able to push it down to multiple enforcers that with zero code would be able to onboard themselves on a maze of applications, API gateways, even DirectDB tools for third party and offshore and outsource, right? This would really be the holy grail to solve this challenge that we are heading fast into. Through regulations or through the need of the zero trust notion or whatever, but this is really how things should be both defined, propagated, and enforced on a large ecosystem of application systems and tools in large organizations.
Makes sense. Okay, so now to my kind of final question for this set, then we'll go to Q&A. And I always like to ask those future statement questions, right? What's the future hold for now that we created this data-centric identity and access management, what the future holds for it? And going back to the title of this webinar, is identity still the perimeter?
I'll jump in and say that it's still one of the perimeters for sure, right? I feel like any real cybersecurity program should be defense in depth based, least privilege based, right? So those are pretty commonsensical, I think, largely. But I think, from a futures perspective, I think as we really don't know what we don't know yet about the influence of AI and its ability to get into the heart of information wherever it may live, and then manifest that through whatever algorithms that they've created. I think the controls around that are going to become just as critical as human access, if not more so, in terms of who's getting access to both corporate and personal data, throughout the ecosystem. But largely from an overall futures perspective in the identity space, I think you're just going to see more optimization around cloud, more services, more capabilities delivered from the cloud that used to be considered legacy, on-premise type solution spaces. The fear of allowing security to be managed from the cloud for my enterprise, I think, has pretty much quiesced, right? It's gone away. So we're over that hurdle. It's the sky's the limit, and deployability from a simplicity perspective, usability from a simplicity perspective are becoming the paramount factors there.
Yeah.
Well, I think the perimeter has been morphed into attributes, right?
That's fair.
The notion of attribute-based access control, right? So there's no one perimeter; it's just a set of attributes that come into mind for any type of access to the data. So that's really the transformation that we see. In addition, what we urge customers is to look at it from a bird's view, right? Not only do this departmental project of applying maybe ABAC, attribute-based access control on Snowflake, right? And then scratching your head once you need to do that to your applications or to your third party, right? Look for technology stack that can really provide a broad coverage into any type of access provision to users. Of course, we might start in Snowflake or Databricks, but definitely it's just the beginning, right? We need to look over and beyond that into DirectDB tools, into applications, native cloud applications, and even on-prem application that in some way or form will need to transform to embrace this attribute-based access control due to regulation, due to different shift in business, or from simply the notion of zero trust.
Makes sense. I would try to continue that attribute approach.
Yeah.
And I would say that, in the age of fake data and fake identities, one of the attributes would be, what's the authenticity of the data and the authenticity of the identities. That would be one of the attributes. Right. And there would be a way to validate that, right? So especially when you go to self-governed, right? So if you were going to do a blockchain for identities,
that's where blockchain start to come into play, right? The general ledger, becomes your friend at that point. Yeah.
So you will need to understand what's real and what's not real, or what's the risk of each one and the authenticity of each one, which again will be another attribute. And as we evolve, there'll be more and more attributes to be calculated, where you're coming from, what's the context of what you're trying to do, what did you do before and after. It's not a per transaction thing, it's a context, as you said, context aware kind of a theme. And that would help us understand, who needs access to what data, and the risks of the identity and the risk of the data as it relates to the context and other attributes in that space. I think that's kind of what's going to happen.
Yes.
That's good. Good discussion. So let's see what's coming from our attendees, if we have any kind of Q&As. Guys, feel free to write your questions in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And we already have a question here. And one of the question is, how is access control made more granular? Role-based access is limited in ability to model large, complex organizations that are common in US government. Anyone wants to take that question?
Sure. So really, this is where the ability to have the interface is required to collect attributes, right, from different sources, whether this is an attribute coming from a data catalog, an attribute comes from your Active Directory, or an attribute comes from your Azure system, pulling those attributes centrally, and then being able to push it down, the attributes and the policies associated with those attributes, to be able to push it down to the different, what we call zero-code enforcers, that we can now deploy. We can deploy them on Tableau or Click. We can deploy them on a native cloud application, or we can deploy it on a legacy application and on a DB, on a direct DB tool. Right? This is really where the RBAC is transforming into ABAC, and it's not replacing RBAC; it's enhancing RBAC. Right? We do not want to come and completely tear out the old RBAC. What we want is to enhance the RBAC into getting more and more rich set of filters, filters around data, filters around identity, filters around purpose, to the accessibility across the application. That's what we've been doing in the last 7 years in large organizations, based on different type of compelling events. But it all comes to this basic concept of pulling the right attributes in a consistent way and being able to push the attributes with associated policies to wherever needed by our customers.
Yeah, I would just add on. I think my work in the past, at least largely with the public sector organizations, I won't name names, but generally they have a tremendous amount of attribution for everything that they do. So just the attribution of a user identity can be, hundreds of attributes depending on the organization or the 3-letter acronym that we're talking about, right? So I think there's one degree of complexity that we're still in many ways trying to solve is that that combinatorial mathematics that's required to be able to marry access to the granularity that's required to define the risk at the data level, right? And to be able to have, that union exist between those things. So I think part of that is being able to calculate some of that rather than store it, to be able to calculate some of that dynamically, based on policy, leveraging algorithmic solutions like machine learning tools and stuff to help build contextual basis and stuff. So I think that's where some of the future's yet to be discerned yet, because we've already seen massive challenges in large organizations where you get into the millions of users with millions of entitlements, right? And that combination becomes huge when you compound that's just the door, if you will, or a specific role permission within an application. That still is not down to the granularity of the data level. That's yet another set of entitlements or permissions that you've got to be able to wrap around that. And so, yeah, it is absolutely a challenge. But I think the good news is that there's cloud scale out there that gives us the ability to address that from a compute and storage perspective. But I think we're starting to get smarter about how we approach the problem, rather than trying to calculate the known state of a user and store that to be referenced, right? We're starting to pull insights, contextual insights at the time of access, and discern whether or not that user should get the access, and then furthermore, whether or not they should see, the data that's associated with that access and so forth.
Right.
Makes sense. And then last question here, it says anonymous attendee, but I have a hunch I know who asked that question. is what's the value add of Secupy to secure the open matrix of data catalogs?
Sure. So yeah, so Secupy has been building a long relationship with all the different data catalogs, from collaboration to the peer review to glue catalog, open source catalogs as well. Where through this relationship and through the development of APIs, we are automatically pulling classifications from those catalogs and enforcing them on a huge amount of applications and systems. This is available in our website in secupy.com coverage. You can see the huge metrics that we support in our customers base, from business applications running on everything, running on Java and .NET, Node.js, Python, different tools and DirectDB connectivity done through pgMin and dbeaver, cloud platforms from RDS, Azure, SQL, and others, and even on-premise, even application running on DB2s, right? Because the catalogs, the whole entire concept is really to be able to classify and to catalog everything everywhere, so it is available in real time to provide this data democratization notion. But then we need to put the controls everywhere, and that's really everywhere. With our super broad platform support that we have been creating in the last 7 years.
Sense. So that's good. As usual, fascinating discussion. So that's great. I think with that, we will finish the webinar, end the webinar. David Culbertson, thank you so much for joining. Always wanted to do a webinar with you.
Yes.
I really appreciate the opportunity to join you guys. It's a pleasure meeting you, Alon, and working with you as well. Great to see you as always. And to the audience out there, let me know if I can help.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.